Thank you, Lizzie. 50 minutes, a big topic. But is it a big topic in South Africa as well? The Jewish community, the Jewish issue, the histories of the Jews in South Africa. Is that something big or something small?
Well, there has been a Holocaust museum, a South African Jewish history museum for a couple of decades. So the history of South African Jewry is in the public domain. And it depends what we mean by big. There are so many pressing issues in South Africa that I wouldn't say it dominates the news.
But it's not unknown.
It's not unknown.
This is your book, Letters of Stone, Brief aus Stein, in the German translation. That must be pretty important to you that it's out in Germany. And we'll talk about the three women there just soon. As shortest introduction to you, you're an anthropologist working at the Stellenbosch University. You grew up in a Jewish family in Port Elizabeth. You're born 1959. Could you just give us an idea of Jewish community in Port Elizabeth, South Africa? What, in the 60s, when you were a child, what are we supposed to think of? How could we imagine that?
Well, I had a particular experience of having a father who fled Germany in 1936, first arrived in Cape Town, ended up in Port Elizabeth where he had a family. And I grew up in a very intense Jewish environment because I went to a Jewish primary school called Theodor Herzl. And so I went there until I was about 13, then I went to a government high school. But in that early period, I was very immersed in a Jewish environment. And, you know, in terms of schooling, in terms of belonging to a synagogue, so it was, I mean, my family weren't very religious, but, you know, we were in an Orthodox synagogue.
And your mother was Jewish?
Yes, yeah.
She was from South Africa?
Yeah, and her parents came from Eastern Europe. So most South African Jews, in fact, came to South Africa in the late 19th century or early 20th century, and from two places, really, Latvia and Lithuania. The Germans
are the Litvaks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the Germans are really German Jews are a minority in South Africa.
Did you feel that as a child, that you
No.
were kind of minority in the minority? Or?
No, not really. Not really.
Tell us about your father. There's a lot of photographs of your father in the book. A very good-looking man, 26. He had 26 years in South Africa before you were born. As I said, as a young man and as an old man, very, very good-looking, with a kind of appetite on life. That's what comes from the pictures. Do the pictures of him, photos of him, tell the truth about him?
I think so. He had, he's obviously been devastated by what happened to his family. But I didn't grow up with a sense of that devastation.
Because he lost all his family.
Except one brother. One brother got out, and the other siblings and parents were murdered in Auschwitz and Riga. But he came out, he spoke with a very thick German accent, so, you know, he was very identifiable as an outsider in South Africa. And we lived pretty much in this, white bubble. This was apartheid. This was growing up in suburbs that were 100% white. And yet he was slightly different to other whites. So I had this sense of him as an older man, and I would sometimes walk with him, and friends would say, "Oh, we saw you with your grandfather." So he had married very late, and that also was a result of what happened. He got out in his late 20s and arrived in South Africa, and it took a lot of time to establish himself. In fact, during the war years, I think because of the stress of trying desperately hard to rescue his family and failing because of the 1936 Immigration Restriction Act in South Africa, which made it impossible to get people out. A few managed to get out after 36, but he was in the process of trying to get his sister Edith out. And that failed, and his health failed. His body collapsed. He ended up in a TB sanatorium during the war years. So and this is what's extraordinary. He had been through all of this, and yet he had a sense of humor. And in fact, his sense of humor saved his life, I would argue. Mm-hmm. And because in 1933, he had been working in Erfurt in a big departmental store there. And he stayed in an apartment, and a woman who lived in that apartment in the same building came one day with swastika earrings, and he said, "My dear, that looks beautiful. You should put one through your nose." And this was before piercing was fashionable, so this wasn't fashion then. And she correctly took it as a sarcastic comment. He was arrested by the Gestapo, spent a few weeks in prison, saw the writing on the wall. The man in the cell next to him was murdered in prison. So this was 33, and he saw what was coming. But in a way, his humor, in the way I see it, and it saved his life in a way. And somehow he never lost that sense of humor, despite the devastation, despite the loss. So, I mean, he was an extraordinary man.
There was a lot of things he didn't tell you, and that's the reason for the book.
Yeah.
And the starting point in the book, and I suppose for you as a writer of the book, as the author of the book, is that photograph that was on the cover. That's your father now. Could you take us back to those three women? In your book it says that's a postcard, or the size of a postcard, and it's a photo that was standing in your home all your childhood, and you never knew who they were.
Yeah, I still find it extraordinary. I mean,
so 20 years looking at these women, and you never said, "Dad, who are they?"
Look, I knew they were family.
You knew they were family, but
Yeah.
you didn't know exactly.
I find it strange to this day that I didn't know their names.
And was that, well, people with the kind of history that you have, they say you know what not to talk about, you know what not to ask about. Was that the thing that's coming out from that photo? Let it be?
I think it's a very complicated story, the story of silence. It's not straightforward. So if you're a youngster growing up in Port Elizabeth then, you're like any other young person. You're not that interested in the history. It doesn't come up. So I would notice the photograph. It was there at the dinner table, not on the dinner table, but next to the dinner table. So it was always almost an image that was present yet absent. And in a way, I only really started wanting to know what happened when I studied to become an anthropologist. I was learning different methods of oral history and so forth. I said, well, what about my own family history? And I did an interview in 1989 with my father.
And then you asked him, who are they?
Yes, then he told me the history of the family, how he grew up in what is now Poland, and after the First World War, the whole family moved to Berlin because that part of Poland, which had been Germany, returned to Polish ownership. And a whole range of reasons, which he alluded to in the interview, led them to decide to move westwards. So I learned about who
are they?
Yeah.
Now we're curious. I've made them curious. Who are they?
Well, on the left is Edith Rybinski. In the center is her mother, Cecily Rybinski. And on the right is Hildegard Rybinski.
So it's your two aunts and your grandma.
Exactly. And that photograph was taken roughly in 1937. Not roughly, it's written on the back, in 1937 in Berlin. And I'm not sure how it got to South Africa. Was the photograph sent and then my father framed it, or did he take it with him? There were all sorts of unknowns, because by the time I started doing this more intense research, my father had passed away. In fact, thank goodness I interviewed him in 1989 because he passed away in 1990. So suddenly, upon his death, I needed to know more. And it became more and more obsessional.
And one of these other naive questions, was he surprised of your interest, or had he been waiting for you?
You know, I mean, it's extraordinary. I wish I could play you the tape of the interview. He says, but why do you want to know this? What's interesting about this? My life was not extraordinary. So there's something about his sense of, you know, this, and maybe that was also amongst his generation. They'd all been through this, the German Jewish refugees who made it to South Africa.
There's no reason talking.
And nobody's really interested. So it's only much later that the interest is generated. And it's generated by organizations who say we need to collect the narratives of survivors and those who are able to flee and so on. So, you know, and that happened largely in the US and in parts of Europe, I imagine. But in South Africa, nobody was particularly interested. It's only much later, when the South African Holocaust Museum is set up in the post-94 period, that it becomes important and people want to record it. Spielberg starts recording survivors all over the world, including South Africa.
The interview you made with your father didn't give that much. It wouldn't have sufficed for a book.
No.
So there was another, your cousin Cecilia, who was the daughter of the other sibling that was saved from the Holocaust by going to Zimbabwe first.
Zimbabwe, then Southern Rhodesia, and they kicked him out. So he started in Cape Town. They gave him a few weeks and told him to move on. Tried in Southern Rhodesia, what is now Zimbabwe, got a few weeks, but eventually was given permission in what was then Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia.
And Cecilia one day called you and said, I've found something. She'd found some letters.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary moment.
What kind of letters and from who?
Okay, so her mother, my late Aunt Elsa, who had managed, she was Sephardic, she had come down from Alexandria, long story, to Cape Town. And she lived there with Arthur. And she passed away, and Cecilia and her brother David were sitting Shiva in the flat, you know, going through the Jewish grieving rituals, and they were part of that, also tidying up the flat, going through things, and they came across this plastic bag of 100 letters that nobody had spoken about, and that phone call was absolutely extraordinary. It's, you know, I sometimes think of myself as a kind of social scientist or, you know, secular person. This to me seemed like a gift from the gods, because to try and put it in context, I had started my search in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I was at an anthropology conference, and I took time out to go to the Holocaust exhibition there. It was my first Holocaust exhibition, and I was quite shaken by it. And I went afterwards to the resource center and spoke to the librarian and said, well, my family were murdered during the Holocaust, and, you know, I just wanted to speak to someone in a way. And he went and got this big, thick black book, the Berliner Gedenkbuch, and he started going through the R's, the Rubinstein, this one eventually gets to Rubinsky, and there's a list of the family. And that, for me, was an absolutely key moment.
We have to say, your family name is actually Rubinsky.
That's right.
But he was anglicized or whatever.
Yes.
To Robbins. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's a whole story, but perhaps we'll get there later. So suddenly, for the first time, I have the names of the people, grandparents and aunts and Uncle Siegfried, and where they were born, when they were deported, where they were deported to. And for me, it was 1996, and I'd been writing in newspapers about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And the relatives of people who were murdered by the security police would give testimony in the hearings, and they'd say, we want to know what happened. Where are the remains of their bodies? And at the time, I was thinking, I need to know what happened to my family. And so those two processes, me generating this need to know and following closely the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa.
That's the commission set up by Desmond Tutu, or the one
Exactly,
he led.
exactly.
Yeah, that's how we knew it.
Yeah. And so I decided to go to Berlin, bought a ticket, went to Berlin, met up with a historian friend who helped me find the building from which my uncle Siegfried was deported from in Kreuzberg. And it was there. I mean, we had the address, and he thought, well, there was so much bombing of Berlin, it's unlikely that the building would be there. It was there. And to cut a long story short, I became friendly with the director of the Kreuzberg Museum because I'd stumbled across the Stolpersteine, these plaques, which are all over Europe, and they're outside the last places of residence of people who were deported. And it just says, here lived so-and-so, deported this date, and the destination of the deportation. So Martin Duspel, the director, said, okay, there's an artist, Gunter Demnig, who's been doing this illegally in Berlin. It's part of an exhibition, but it's a temporary exhibition. He's put these plaques in, but the municipality will want to take them out. And we went through a process of meeting with officials in the Berlin Municipal Council, and eventually they said, okay, we'll take this on as an official project of Berlin, and that's a story in itself. So the Rubinski Stolpersteine in Nauninstrasse in Kreuzberg were the first official legal Stolpersteine, and now they're about 90,000 to 100,000 throughout Europe. So in a way, that was a crucial moment for me. And I thought, I've done all I could, because I'd got some archival material, but it was like the basic raw facts of, what happened to each of my family members. But it gave me no insight into who they were.
No voices, no smell,
Nothing, no biographical.
Nothing to take.
Absolutely.
Your hands.
And I thought, well, at least I've been able to commemorate who they are. There's a place, and we did it for the grandparents and for Hildegard and Edith in Mitte in Berlin a year later. So I thought that's the end of the chapter. Then the letters came. I thought that was as far as I could go.
And what kind of letters were there?
They're absolutely extraordinary. So I remember Cecilia calling me, and none of us read German for a start, and she was trying to read these. She knows more German than I do. Unfortunately, my father never taught me German, and my son is learning German, by the way, so something's going on there.
For him.
Yes, and he's been exposed to all of this. So this has had real effects in the world, far more than any academic paper I've written. So what happened there, I rushed to Cecilia and David's place, and we sat down, and you had these, let me just show you these letters. Some of you will have seen them. We can go back to some of these images if you want. But this is what these letters look like. And again, to cut to the chase here in a way, we needed a translator. And as it happened, we found this extraordinary translator. But before we could even get translation done, this had to be transcribed into modern German. So the Kreuzberg Museum volunteered. They said, we want to do this. And for me, I mean, that museum, I just have absolute respect for them. They sat there, a team of 5 or 6 of them, for a very long time, transcribing every single letter, from the Gothic script, which most modern Germans would struggle to read, into typed up letters. And then a woman in Cape Town, Jutta Ben Joseph, she went and she started this process of translating them. And it wasn't simply translation of language, it was translation of emotion as well. And I mean, again, I'll write a bit about this. What is the role of the translator in all of this? In my experience with Jutta, it was extraordinary. She tried to mediate my access to the pain that she experienced reading them raw in German. I read them in English, so there was a bit of distance. And she would tell me, look, I'm going to send you a letter. So she would start off with these quite light letters. The first one I remember was a letter. It wasn't a letter, it was a poem that was composed, a kind of song and poem that was composed for my Uncle Siegfried's wedding. And it was done in 1934. The Nazis had come to power. But this letter was very much, it was very humorous. It was about Siegfried, this carefree man who now was married and was committing. And this extraordinary poem, or I imagine it was sung or recited in any way. But then the letters got more and more serious. And Jutta would tell me, look, I'm concerned about sending you the next letter. And she'd try and prepare me for it. So it was an extraordinary process. It wasn't a straightforward technical process of just getting the letter from German to English.
And in the book, there's a lot of letters, or not all of them, but a lot of letters are reprinted in the book. And reading them, you get the sense that there is a family tradition of not speaking out so much. So your father, you recognize your father's silence in a way, because it's partly due to the conditions. They didn't know whether somebody would read the letters and stop them if they said too much. But the letters are really concerning your father's efforts to get the family out or to get away from Germany in any direction. And it failed. And with time, they are more and more aware that it's going to fail. But they keep the spirits up, trying to comfort him, I suppose. And it's extraordinary that they manage to write so much about everyday life, small occasions, and not letting the emotions take them away. Do you recognize your father's attitude towards life in those letters as well?
Yes, in a way. But I learned through reading and rereading those letters, reading between and beyond the lines. I had to decode what was being said because, as you mentioned, there was self-censorship. And my grandmother was the major letter writer. And I learned that she was a stoic woman, a religious woman. I thought we'd come from the secular family, but the letters were peppered with references to perhaps God will hear us and will be rescued. And so, she would say sometimes perhaps we'll be rescued by decent Germans or by the international community. So there was this optimism that she seemed to have. And the letters were also saturated with the mundane, quotidian, everyday rituals of domesticity. And that's the way I write about it. You know, I am an anthropologist and we look at ritual, but the everyday rituals of coffee and cake, card games that my grandfather had, birthdays, Jewish festivals, she would report on all of this. And the letters were gained sometimes via Sweden, because of the neutrality of Sweden, so perhaps you could get it to South Africa without censorship, all sorts of devices. And these letters would go perhaps to Arthur, and then he'd forward them on. So he was in Zambia, he'd forward them on to my father was in Port Elizabeth. And the letters would be about this everydayness, but I interpreted it as precisely this, a way to cushion my father and Arthur from the realities that they were facing. And so at the same time, they were also about holding the family together when the outside world was shattering apart Jewish family life. You were reduced to refuge in the home space. The streets were dangerous, public spaces were no longer accessible. So in that decade, between 33 and when the deportations took place, there was a slow, systematic stripping down of people, as you know, of livelihood, of profession, of possibility of participating in public life of any sort. Recreational spaces were shut down, etc. And she was trying to hold the family together. And these everyday rituals of cake and coffee, shopping, and all of that she was writing to her sons about, gave me an insight into something that I would think is familiar in places of war all over the world and across time. Women are often the ones who are doing that work of holding the family together in these contexts of fragmentation, of shattering, and so I would read these letters and also wonder why she would jump from one issue to the next, and it would be sometimes disjointed, there'd be a lot of repetition and so forth. And I began to realize that even though she was trying to convey to my father and his brother Arthur about the seriousness of the situation, she was also trying to convey, we're okay. You know, we had a nice evening of this card game that my grandfather played with two friends. Things would be disguised. She didn't say who these friends were. She'd give them, the doctor would be this man. I don't know why she would do that, I speculate. And so there was a tension between conveying to my father and his brother how serious the situation is. So the letters were full of these accounts of every single family member trying to get out, and they were prepared to go anywhere. They were talking about Chile, they were talking about Argentina, and some did. They were talking about China, they were, UK as domestic. There was an idea that perhaps Edith could be a domestic worker in the UK, but countries didn't want them. That's what I learned in this whole story. The wall shut, and its resonance with contemporary issues, perhaps we can talk about later, but it was extraordinary, the complexity of a woman who's carrying the burden of trying to hold this family together, trying to convey to her sons how serious the situation was, but that we're still okay. And at the same time, she couldn't afford to really reveal the strain on her. But the translator again would tell me she wanted to try and correct the grammar, the repetition, the fragmentation, and I asked her not to. And because there was so much reading between and beyond the lines, and I learned an enormous amount about my grandmother.
And the silent drama in your book is that there are no letters from your father or your uncle back to her. So we look at his smiling face and his beautiful face and try to understand what he might have written back. And that's all we can do. We could go so much further into the family, into the lives of your uncle, but this book contains two perspectives. It's one which is personal, and we've dwelled on that, but then it's the professional perspective, because you couldn't really refrain from being an anthropologist, as you've said several times already, when looking at your family. And we'll make a big jump. As an anthropologist, you came upon the name of Eugen Fischer, and he plays a big role in your book and in history, and the history of eugenics, which is rashygien på svenska. Who was Eugen Fischer, and how did you come upon him?
Yes, it's a long story, but let me try and convey key aspects of that story. So when I went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., amongst many things I saw, there was an exhibition about Eugen Fischer. And I was intrigued because I'm an anthropologist, and I was interested in the complicity of my discipline in Nazi eugenics, in racial science. So I recalled that, and it was somewhere in my memory. And along the way of trying to understand about my family, I ended up in a remote town called Williston in the Northern Cape province in South Africa, because a great uncle of mine had fled Königsberg, Kaliningrad now, in the 1880s, and ended up in this small town in the Karoo in South Africa. And my father had mentioned him, because I think why my father went to South Africa was because he knew they were family. He had been out of contact with them, but he knew Eugen Rabinski, his father's brother, had ended up there. So that was a factor. So in the town, I remember I met the local historian, and she told me that there had been people who called themselves busters, mixed race people of European and indigenous ancestry. And they'd lived there and they'd been pushed off the land as a result of racial land laws and dispossession, and they'd ended up in German Southwest Africa in the 1870s.
Which is now called Namibia,
Now,
so the
Namibia.
geography right.
So I started following that because I realized, wait, this is very interesting. You know, so, yeah.
In order to, because I'd never heard about this group before. There's a group of people, they were originally children of white men and black women.
Yeah.
And they stayed together as a tribe or a group, or how would you describe
A group.
it? A group of
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
How many were they?
There were many. I mean, I don't have numbers. They were in different parts of the
Thousands
Northern
of
Cape.
them.
Yes,
It's not
yes,
just
yes.
occasionally
No,
born
no,
children.
very many. Yeah.
Okay. And they were driven up there to Namibia. Now go on.
So they ended up in a place called Rehoboth, where they established a kind of a settlement. And they were, working with missionaries as well, who had tried to protect them early on. And the settlement was visited in 1908 by Eugen Fischer, the German anatomist, physical anthropologist. And Fischer did these studies of, mixed race people because he wanted to prove something in eugenics. And it's a long story about what he was trying to prove. But suddenly I realized this intersection of my professional life and Eugen Fischer and the connection between colonial science and what happened in Germany. And I mean, you probably all know Hannah Arendt's argument about the boomerang effect, where racial science and racial violence in the colonies connected in certain ways with what happened in Germany in the 30s. And this figure, Eugen Fischer, did his major ethnographic study on the Rehoboth. Hitler read the monograph in 1923 when he was in prison in Munich. And to cut a long story short, he appointed Fischer as the chancellor of the university in Berlin in 1933. Fischer became a very senior figure in Nazi racial science. He became the first director already in 1927 of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. So suddenly, these connections were happening. And in a way, it's like the Stolpersteiner. I stumbled across this history that took me from South Africa to Williston, to Namibia, back to Berlin. And, it wasn't that I set out to find these connections, but Eugen Fischer became the key to understand the emergence of this racial science that was cosmopolitan science. In Sweden, you had compulsory sterilization into the 1970s, the 1990s. There were very vigorous debates in Sweden about the legacy of eugenics. And some argued the failure to really reflect on that history. Because,
Could we just go back to his, you said it's a long story to find out what Eugen Fischer was looking for. But could you make it short, because it's so interesting? He knew about this group.
yes.
White men, black women, and then what? Can you make it? What did he want to prove by examining them? It was he measured them, skull and all that.
Measured everything.
Usual racial stuff. What did he want to prove by describing this group?
He wanted to look at the physical and psychological and intellectual outcomes of racial miscegenation. And the
And his thesis was that should be forbidden, or that...
Well, it's interesting. So in 1933, he gives a lecture where he says, well, it's interesting. Jews are racially mixed. They have Asiatic and they have West European ancestry, and not all of it is pathological, and it doesn't always produce inferiority, and he gives some examples of Jewish achievement. And he says, similarly, with the Rehoboth busters, there is a possibility of a racial hybrid vigor, is the term he used. Perhaps it actually makes them more adapted to the environment and so on. So it's doesn't all weaken the descendants at the psychological, physiological, and intellectual level. There may be something that strengthens the population. So he was open to that idea.
But that he had to take back then.
He retracted.
Being an official in Nazi Germany.
Exactly. He got a lot of pushback from the top echelons of the Nazi party, and he was a very ambitious man. He wanted his institute to be the leading institute in the world. And eugenics was a global science. I mean, this is what I had to get my head around. One often thinks, well, it was a German invention. And we know Sweden was at the cutting edge, the US was at the cutting edge. And UK, that's where it came from. I mean, Galton and various others were key figures in the emergence of eugenics as a science in the mid-19th century. So I was tracking the science, and it led me to understand why my father failed to rescue his family. Because doors were shutting across the world, because Jews, particularly East European Jews, and in the US in 1924 with the Immigration Restriction Act, it was lobbied by eugenics scientists and activists to shut down the possibility of East European Jews to come into the US and mess up the Nordic genetic makeup of white Americans. So it was part of white nationalism, and there wasn't even much of an attempt in reading all these letters. I didn't pick up any attempt to get to the United States. And this, we're talking early, we're talking 36, 38 onwards, that already realized it's just impossible. And this was across the board. Countries were not interested in Jews, and eugenics played a role in that.
There is a ending point in the history of Eugen Fischer. He had a infamous student called Dr. Mengele, whom he pushed in his career, and we all know where that ended. You grew up in apartheid South Africa and became an anthropologist. You must have reflected a lot on the relation between the apartheid theory or ideology and the racial issues or racial ideology put forward by these researchers and then put into politics by the Nazis. How do you see the connection between the apartheid ideology, the racism and the institutional racism in South Africa and the apartheid?
Well, okay, so I'm at a university that was really the intellectual bedrock of apartheid ideology. And Werner Iserlohn and Hendrik Verwoerd, who were two key figures. They were the architects of apartheid ideology, studied in Germany, and as did many other very senior Afrikaner nationalist figures who became very important. Verwoerd became the prime minister in 1948 when the Afrikaner nationalists came to power and introduced apartheid as official policy. So the German connection is there, and they're very good historians who are looking at precisely this issue. They're looking at, what did they bring into apartheid ideology in terms of their exposure to German science, human sciences. It's complicated because after the Second World War, eugenics was discredited because of the final solution and its implication in that. So the apartheid state did not go that route directly. They tried to frame what they were doing as cultural self-determination. So we're going to divide up all black Africans into tribes, even if they didn't subscribe to that. Mandela said, no, we're Africans, we're black South Africans, we're not Xhosa, Sotho, Swana, Venda, Zulu, and all these other tribes. So this is the route they took. They didn't take a direct racial biology route, but race and races and scientific racism was always there. And there are very good historians who are unpacking these complicated connections. So it's not a straight line from Nazi eugenics to apartheid ideology. They were interested more in nationalism, Afrikaner nationalism, and then white nationalism, and in divide and rule along the lines of Lord Lugard, who gave this British policy of indirect rule legitimacy, supposedly. So it was a way of working with ethnic separation, Bantustans, as those who opposed the system called it, separate development, which is the word that apartheid comes from. They try to move away from the term apartheid because it was correctly seen as absolutely derogatory, negative, and social engineering of the worst sort. So they moved to separate development. They were constantly trying to sanitize what they were doing through different terms. But it had a complicated relationship to eugenics. It wasn't obvious.
Coming back to the personal side of your book, how did your Jewish community, your father, your family, and the bigger Jewish community see these things? Did they, well, in quotes, you can't speak for everybody, but was it, did they see the relation between what their families had gone through and apartheid?
Yeah. Let me give you an example here. So when I was at the University of Cape Town, I was exposed to a kind of radical politics, and my father got very worried. He said, please don't get involved. And he was, because he'd had this devastating encounter with the Gestapo and then what followed, already in his late 20s. And so he was quite terrified of confronting authoritarianism, and because of his experiences. So I think his response was to just, go under the radar.
He kind of recognized them.
He recognized, as he stepped off the boat, virtually.
Yeah.
In 1936, there were Nazis at the harbor. I mean, I could show you some of these images, perhaps, to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. This wasn't very subtle stuff. I mean, so that article is written by Verwoerd, who later becomes the first prime minister who introduces apartheid in 1948. And he, as a younger man, was protesting against the Stuttgart, which was a ship of German Jewish refugees, the last ship to really get out and make it to South Africa. And he mobilized people against Jewish immigration, and in fact, he was successful in changing the legislation, tightened up even further. So he knew what this was about.
They don't want us.
They don't want us. But he didn't have the possibility to really express it politically.
Was he a good representative of the Jewish attitude towards apartheid, saying we're white but not white enough?
Well, what is interesting, it's a very complicated community. So I would say the vast majority of South African Jews, as I said, came from Eastern Europe, and they tried to become white, really. It was initially when they arrived in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they were seen as other. They were seen as these fundamentally different people. They were working class and quite poor, Yiddish speaking. They dressed strangely. They weren't seen as proper Europeans. But over a generation or two, they learned how to become white, how to become settlers. First assimilate into the English culture, and then somehow manage the shift, which was quite devastating in 1948 when Afrikaner nationalists came to power, because they knew these people had supported Nazi Germany. Verwoerd and a whole range of them overtly supported Germany. So Foster...
That's why your father said,
he said, this is...
Take your head down.
Yeah.
Don't fight.
But then there were Jews who came from Eastern Europe who had already been communists there. Ray Alexander, Joe Slovo, Ronnie Kasrils, you name them. I mean, the Jewish composition within the South African Communist Party was extraordinary in the early 20th century. And in a way, they were very key figures in the liberation movement. I mean, Joe Slovo was a very key figure in the Umkhonto weSizwe, the military wing of the ANC. So there were Jews who really saw the connections, and they had the political ideology and commitment to really take it on. But they hadn't been, I've tried to understand why my father didn't go that route. He wasn't political, even in Germany. You know, he was trying to survive, trying to save his family.
And he had some experience of not surviving, so
yeah,
can't really blame him for anything.
I don't.
Our time is limited, but we have to touch on one hot topic in contemporary discussions. There is in Germany specifically, but also in America and the UK, and I suppose in South Africa, and to some extent in Sweden, a discussion on which, put it bluntly, which genocide came first, which genocide inspired the other, or then somebody says you can't compare anything like that. As an anthropologist, what is your stand on this discussion that some people have described as a competition between genocides?
Yeah.
Can you differ your personal view from your view as an anthropologist, or is this somewhere where everything just gets...
Yeah. I think it's very complicated. Am I trying to cop out of this question? Well, I do think there's something in Michael Rothberg's book on multidirectional memory, and I don't know whether it's read in Sweden. I find it an important contribution.
What does he mean by multidirectional memory?
He's a literary scholar, and he looks at early figures such as Hannah Arendt, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, such as Césaire and others, who had a sense of solidarity that transcended their own people, in a way. They said their connections between Black historical experience and what happened in Nazi Germany. And in fact, Du Bois goes to the Warsaw Ghetto, and he writes in a very powerful way about how devastating that experience for him was, and he interprets what it means for him. So there was that. And in a way, I'm drawn to Rothberg's recuperation of that earlier, more internationalist perspective, where it wasn't saying, creating hierarchies of suffering. I think there is something very singular about the Holocaust. But in my own work, I see their continuities. These key racial scientists moved between the colonies and Europe, and I track them, and I show the links. And I'm not the first to do that. Others have done that. And it's quite a complicated set of questions, and it needs to be nuanced. And I would find it very disappointing if it is about hierarchies of suffering, only about the scales. I mean, it's clear for me that the Nazi genocide was unprecedented. But prior to the genocide, these racial laws had precedence in the colonies. So Fisher allows you to see that he makes recommendations in his second edition of his book, where he starts saying, well, we need to prevent racial miscegenation, racial mixing in the colonies, and he applies that in Germany to Jews and Gypsies, Roma and Sinti. So,
and you understand the emotions that are raised by this discussion.
Yes.
For instance, in Germany, it's a very emotional, and not just emotional, but intellectual and emotional discussion.
Yeah. And, there will be ways of thinking about it. If we're going to look at these debates in 5 years' time, it will be interesting to see what emerges from it. But I wouldn't shut them down. But, I think it's a good thing for scholars such as Rothberg and others to put these ideas out. I mean, he's a comparative literature scholar. So comparison is important. And it's a long discussion.
Down is not our task, is it? But encouraging them to talk. Stephen Robbins, it was great having you here and great having this discussion. I hope you will have similar discussions with others in Göteborg. Thank you for coming
Thank
to
you.
Stockholm, sharing your views and presenting your book to us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you, Lizzie. And thank you all. Thank you. Thanks.